One of the fiercest console rivalries of all time, I think, has to be between the PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 360 fanboys. And whilst a lot of those Xbox 360 exclusives like Fable, Gears of War and Halo eventually got ported to other platforms, there's still a bunch of PlayStation 3 exclusives that have remained that way ever since, probably because of how hard it was to work with the PS3's hardware. Titles like Metal Gear Solid 4, the Killzone series, and case in point Infamous, what is probably the best superhero game of all time.
He ain't lying.
At least the best one that deals with an origin story. You have to keep in mind too that when this game came out, that was really the beginning of that golden era for all these full-on open-world sandbox games. The improved hardware of these new consoles allowed for some truly large environments, which is something I think Assassin's Creed also helped to kick off. This meant we started to see a huge influx of these larger scope games which could take advantage of this new technology, and Infamous I think is a perfect example of that. It was developed by Sucker Punch, responsible for the awesome Sly Cooper series, and more recently their work on Ghost of Tsushima, but out of their entire portfolio, I think the first Infamous game is their best work. The big comparison that everyone made at the time was to Prototype, a similar themed game where you played as someone imbued with superpowers and got dropped in a sandbox world where an entire city ended up being your toilet. Compared to Infamous though, Prototype was devoid of any real character choice. You just played as this super edgy dude wearing a hoodie that had blades coming out of his arms and could also elbow drop onto army tanks. Prototype was also a lot more accessible, available on not only the PlayStation 3, but then also the Xbox 360 as well as the PC. Just kind of makes Infamous seem even more unique to me, and considering soon there's talks that people might be able to play it without the need for an actual PlayStation 3 console, well, I thought it might be worth going back and taking a look at it. Seeing if I can put into words why I think Sucker Punch are able to catch lightning in a bottle.
Just hope it's not too late.
The story is you're playing as a guy named Cole, a courier just delivering another package, a package that happens to be some kind of bomb that goes off and destroys a couple of city blocks, killing everyone in its radius, but then also converting that energy into Cole, giving him superpowers.
What the hell happened?
This turns him into something called a conduit, and that's something the general public perceive as terrorists, and then that also creates a rift between him and his girlfriend Trish, who at that point is just a bit of a cold-hearted bitch.
Whatever there'd been between Trish and me was gone.
As a result of this event, the government then cuts the city off from the outside world until they decide how they want to handle it, which in turn gives rise to all of these criminal factions across these 3 islands. Yeah, the perfect timing for someone to be imbued with superpowers and rock up to save the day. Well then again, maybe not, because one of the main features of the game is its whole moral system, where at key points in the game you're given the option of being either good or just outright bad. The only issue is that these really are black and white, basically just being good to the point of being an altar boy, or bad to the point of being comically bad.
If I turn that valve, I'll take another blast of crud to the face. Or maybe I force this guy to do it for me.
Bruh.
Like going around kicking sand in someone's face and knocking the coffee cups out of their hands. Yeah, mean shit.
I could heal him. Or I could just grab his shards and take off.
What an asshole.
One of the first decisions you have to make is to whether or not you're going to share food rations with all these starving civilians. And you either let these guys get their share, or you zap them and then keep the whole thing for yourself. It's kind of like you're playing as either modern day Batman or Cesar Romero's Joker. It's a long ways from the complex moral compass of a game like Fallout New Vegas, let's just put it that way. And because I'm such a goddamn pussy, every time I play through this, I always have to go for the good route. I don't know what it is about me, but I just kind of find it really hard being a dick to people in video games. I don't really find it hard giving the dick to people in video games, you know, if you catch my drift.
I know this is hard.
But playing the part of this all-out super asshole just isn't something that I find fun in. Kind of funny too in the way that it actually treats the morals of the side characters, I think, with way more depth than it does with Cole. Main antagonist of the game is a dude named Kessler, and he's a guy who kind of keeps popping up here and there to bust Cole's balls. And he's seen as this incredibly powerful figure behind a mysterious group called the First Sons. As far as we know, he's a clear-cut bad guy, and they really want you to hate him. But then when you finally take him on for the final confrontation and learn the truth behind who he is and why he's doing what he's doing, which, you know, has to be one of the best plot twists of all time, then suddenly your whole perspective on the guy becomes all fucked up. And then you start to think about whether or not the end justified the means. Another one of the main antagonists, the guy who controls the second island, is a powerful conduit named Alden, who got orphaned as a kid and then had to live on the street after losing his entire family. Over the years, he's grown to resent society and he became angry with the world, and it kind of starts to make sense why this guy would end up becoming a tragic villain.
The blast has made him powerful, gave him the tools to combat his paranoia.
I do think Cole's buddy Zeke is kind of annoying though.
Yeah, that's an understatement.
And it is a bit lazy that they go down the whole jealous best friend route with him.
What are you saying?
He's by Cole's side almost the entire time, through thick and thin, but then for some reason, at one point in the game, he starts to get all bitchy and whiny. And I mean, look dude, if your best mate gets superpowers and you just can't be super proud and happy for them, well, then that just makes you a fucking dickhead. But it is kind of cool the way that it shows how Cole's powers affect everyone around him, for better or for worse.
Not by a long shot.
My favourite superhero movie of all time is Spider-Man 2, mostly because it's got Kirsten Dunst in her prime in it, but also because it makes Peter Parker deal with his personal life as much as it does the one behind his mask. The best superhero stories, I think, are the ones where the hero has to deal with the collateral and the ramifications for living another secret life. And that's what makes Infamous so captivating, because Cole not only has to deal with the greater threat of the Reapers, the Dustmen, and the First Sons, but also his relationships on the side, his best buddy Zeke and his girlfriend Trish.
I'll find out what's going on.
It's just a very believable series of hardships that makes his character far more endearing.
She didn't say a word. No emotion, nothing, just walked away.
Now, compared to other superhero games like the Arkham series, Infamous really is an origin story. You're not starting the game as an established character, you're not Spider-Man or Batman, you're playing as Cole from the beginning of him getting these powers, and then playing through this journey where he eventually turns into what's basically a borderline demigod.
Still powering up.
At the beginning of the game though, about all you can do is jump off high buildings and shoot lightning bolts out of your hands. You can climb up pretty much anything. In fact, the parkour system's actually still pretty impressive, even by today's standards. But otherwise, you're still a pretty weak and vulnerable dude, and the earlier sections of the game are actually kinda tough because of just how easily you can still get gunned down. Gunned down like a little bitch.
Holy shit!
That does all change the further you get into the game, of course, as you unlock all of these new abilities and become much more powerful. To the point that you not only go from shooting lightning out of your hands, but eventually able to summon it out of the sky and then drop it on groups of enemies at once.
Impressive. Very nice.
Throughout the city are a few hundred blast shards, powered up pieces of metal you can collect to incrementally increase your energy bar, and it just becomes downright addicting running around and collecting these things. Overall, it really handles that power progression perfectly, and every time you get that new power or ability, there's a shift in how you play the game, making you feel much more competent. It really just is masterfully done stuff, and I can't think of any other game that got this progression so spot on. That also carries across to your moral system too. Because the more famous or infamous you get, the more you start to see people in the city reacting to your presence. If you go the route of the good guys, citizens are going to start to cheer you on as you run past, they'll take photos and shout out your name. There's even random little encounters where you can find someone getting held up at gunpoint and save them. You know, not stuff on the map or side missions, but just random little events that remind you that you're really this shining beacon of light in a cesspool of a city. A big focus of the story is getting all these new powers and abilities to make you stronger, and this is done by exploring all of these underground substations, and then getting jacked up on raw electricity. Like you're getting crucified by these power outlets and then charged up like a human battery. Kinda works twofold too, because it restores the power to an area of the city, making it safe to explore, but it also gives Cole a new ability. In any other game, this would be just a repetitive mechanic, but here it's the basis for getting all of your new powers, and it kinda motivates you to get through these things even more. Plus, I just think that these are really fun sequences. Moving through these pitch black areas feels like you're urban exploring these dilapidated facilities, you know, that the city's just completely forgot about. And I kinda like too how Cole's body works as the only light source. Plus, they often serve as short tutorials for whatever new ability you've just gotten, and there's a pretty cool bunch of them to play around with. I mean, Infamous is really just a third-person shooter. There's no guns or anything like that, but what you're shooting out of your hands is the equivalent in a lot of ways to a pistol, rifle, and shotgun. You start off with just a basic lightning attack, which you can always pretty much spam indefinitely, and a shockwave ability, which is kind of like a kinetic blast, knocking back props like cars, but also able to push back enemies, ideally off rooftops, where they can then fall to their death. You got the Thunder Drop, which is probably my favorite move in the game, which works in tandem with the complete lack of fall damage. so you can jump off high roofs and slam into a bunch of enemies at once, which really never does get old.
Surprise, motherfucker!
Along with a basic dodge roll move, which you're going to be spamming like crazy when things get heated up. But as you start exploring all of these substations, you start to get a bunch of new abilities. Like being able to throw out your lightning in a ball, you know, like a grenade. There's a precision shot, which is more or less like a sniper rifle, really handy for zapping dudes in the head when they're hanging back, and too far out of range for your standard attacks to hit them. Then later on there's a more powerful electric blast, which is basically a rocket launcher. Then on the other hand, there's less combat focused abilities, like being able to grind along these power lines, which is hands down one of the coolest looking moves in the game. You can even upgrade this to recharge your energy at the same time. There's a glide move, making parkour and getting around the rooftops a lot easier, and early on the option to either heal or leech energy from injured civilians, which again kind of plays a big part in the whole black and white moral code.
Great! I can't tell you what this means to me.
The final power though is the best one by far. We can drop down a fucking lightning bolt and then steer it around with the 6-axis controls. Hands down the best implementation of the 6-axis controls I've ever seen.
Holy shit!
Considering though, I think it's the only time I've ever seen the 6-axis used was in the Killzone games, where there it was about as fluid as trying to sign your name on a postcard with a dog turd. When you finally get to this point where everything is unlocked, you pretty much become unstoppable, and dropping a massive shit on enemies in the form of a lightning bolt the size of Zeus's dick never stops being awesome. It's all connected to an upgrade system where you can spend XP earned through the missions and enemy kills on improving all of these abilities. A lot of these are skill based too, like managing to get a grenade stuck to an enemy's leg or something. It's gonna net you far more XP than just having it blow up at their feet. Or taking someone down with a headshot's worth more than just a standard body takedown. Then you spend all those points earned on making noticeable improvements to your powers. Basic lightning bolt can be upgraded so headshots chain lightning to nearby enemies and to also restore energy on each hit. I mean, that's effective. Or with the shockwave, it can be upgraded so it holds enemies in stasis for a few seconds, which, you know, is kind of fun if you want to watch some asshole slowly fall to their death. Probably one of the best ones is for one of your last powers. You see, eventually you unlock like this protective shield, which blocks all incoming damage from a single direction. And an upgrade for this means that all damage to the shield is converted into energy. And seeing as energy also regenerates your health, yeah, you can imagine how that becomes downright broken. The fact that every ability is so easy to use and remember what it's mapped to, I think also speaks a lot about how well they've integrated it all into the gameplay. One thing that kind of bothers me about all these modern console games is how fucking confusing the controls can be, and how much crap they've packed into all the available buttons. With Infamous though, it feels like every single button on that controller has been assigned to what it should be. From zooming in to make a precision shot, to sending out your aura to track nearby power sources. Now you might have noticed by now, but Infamous really does look like an early PlayStation 3 game through and through, and it's definitely kind of lacking when it comes to the diversity of colours. Often using a combination of grey, brown, and then some more grey. That is kind of by design though, and again, it was the style back at the time. It just kind of seems game back then during this period were always trying to look super grungy, and other PS3 titles like Resistance and Killzone 2 I think are good examples of that. There must have been a memo going around Sony at the time making sure people kept their colour palette extremely limited, and Infamous is the grey-brown poster child for that design choice.
Didn't know we needed any.
Along with the memo for making sure every video game protagonist had to have a goddamn shaved head.
Hypocrites.
Sadly too, it doesn't run all that great at times, and it's often got a really choppy frame rate. It is a game that came out relatively early into the console's lifespan, and it's sadly not one of its better performers. But I never thought that that came at the expense of how well I could play the game though, and it still has a pretty unique style that's like a combination of a comic book and the best that they could do to depict a realistic world. Another aspect that really shines here is the music, and I think anyone who's played this is no doubt going to remember it pretty well. At one point I even had this soundtrack on my iPod, and I'm not talking about my iPhone or my iPad, no, my iPod.
Are you insane?
And the reason it works so well is because it doesn't overshadow the gameplay. Sometimes you play games where the music just takes over what's happening and kind of detracts from the experience, or in the worst cases it doesn't even match up. The music here though seems to accompany the action. It really does sound like a backing track, and it doesn't take your focus away from the task at hand, and that's a good thing. One of my all-time favorite tracks in any video game ever is the music you first hear when you start to encounter the Reapers. It just always instantly reminds me of taking on this hostile faction of total assholes. Now, having said all of this, there still are a few things that I want to bitch about.
Horrible things. Beyond description.
Now, with the parkour and the movement, although you do eventually get better options for moving laterally, in the form of being able to grind along power lines and train lines, you never get any better option for moving faster vertically. Getting to the top of buildings is a slow and often tedious routine of just jumping over and over until you reach the top. Compared to other games like Assassin's Creed, where you'd often just hold down a single button, here it's much more dynamic and dependent on jumping to the right spots, rather than just, kind of mashing the jump button over and over. The parkour is fine too when you're trying to make broad and general movements, but it also suffers horribly when you're trying to be precise because Cole has this weird ability to magnetize to a nearby surface automatically. Like this bit here, all I'm trying to do is jump off this fucking power line and land on this truck, but he keeps snapping back onto the power line like it's surgically attached. It's actually one of the few things I preferred about Prototype over Infamous. I mean, in that game you could just hold down the sprint button and then run up pretty much any single surface. That alone is all I like about Prototype. The second thing is that no matter how strong or powerful you become, there's always going to be someone somewhere on a rooftop off in the distance shooting you with an assault rifle, and it's something that never stops being annoying. Infamous honestly has some of the most annoying enemies of all time, and I can say without hyperbole that I fucking hate the Reapers with a passion. These are the first enemy faction you come up against, and there's something about their design and appearance that just really sticks a pine cone up my ass, to the point that I actively seek them out just to kill them. Their backstory is that they're drug dealers, junkies and criminals, and they took their shot when the city went to hell and started pillaging and raping everything they could get their hands on. There's an early mission where you're clearing out their hideout before you move on to the second island, and I had so much fun killing all these assholes that I feel like I should be put on some kind of watch list. And I feel like that's all payback for any number of the couple of dozen instances when one of them was off on a rooftop somewhere shooting at me all the time like an asshole. Dealing with this does get easier once you get that precision bolt, because you can easily line a shot up and take their head right off. But it's annoying enemy behaviour that begins right from the very first mission in the game and continues pretty much up until the end. But the worst thing by far though are the enemies with rocket launchers, and I don't know what it was about these games on the PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 360, but it just seemed like every game back then had to have enemies with rocket launchers thrown in with the standard ones so it was harder to identify them. I mean, right around the time you'd identify Rocket Man, burning out his fuse up here alone was around the same time you also caught one to the face. Now, as for the missions, things do start off tame, but by the end, you're getting into some pretty huge scrapes. The kind of scrapes that, again, can take a serious toll on the PlayStation 3's performance. It's kind of a shame, too, that Sucker Punch didn't seem to know how to make the game more challenging in those later missions, outside of just throwing more enemies at you.
Don't stop!
There's also a real reliance on gun turrets, really powerful placements that you can only take out with explosives, or by targeting a pinhole-sized gap in between the armored front, and those things are about as fun as a dick ward. One of the hardest missions I think is this one on the back of the world's slowest moving bus that you've got to escort to a hospital. And look, don't get me wrong, right? It's a classic superhero move, helping innocent injured people. But it's also classic video game bullshit. And I mean, if this was real life and you were taking so much small arms fire, I really doubt someone would be driving this thing down the street like a senior citizen. Later on, when you're defending a prison during an attempted breakout, it's just this bottleneck of enemies swarming in that you pretty much have to spam with rocket and grenade attacks to keep at bay. It's kind of like that scene when the orcs are blowing up the wall in Helm's Deep in Lord of the Rings and they all just start funneling in. Yeah, same thing. They even throw in a few tank enemies to make the whole thing even more over the top too. Thankfully though, these only show up later in the game and they're basically just giant piles of reanimated trash, and there's not really any strategy to fighting them outside of just, not getting hit and spamming the shit out of your most powerful attacks. What I've always really kind of thought was the most fun about Infamous though was all of the side missions. Now, this is an open world game, which means you've got an entire city to liberate from all of these various enemy factions. And the way you do that is by completing side missions, which then frees up a small chunk of the map. And then once you've done this like 20 or so times, that island's going to be free of enemies entirely. Usually in these kind of games, it's just repeating the same couple of activities over and over, but it really seems like Sucker Punch have tried to make this as varied as possible.
Hang on a second.
So a side mission might just be something as simple as defeating a bunch of Reapers or blowing up a truck. But then there's missions where you need to beat a single powerful conduit. There's ones where you got to follow echoes of the past, tracking a ghostly outline to a set location. A really cool ones where you need to escort captured gang members to a nearby police station, zapping them in the ass to keep them moving, along with dealing with them when they try to fight back and escape.
Get going.
You might have to rescue hostages, destroy surveillance equipment on the side of buildings, escort a train to the nearest station to get the trains running on the island again, or do a bunch of flashy moves for a would-be Peter Parker to capture photos of.
Awesome, just need a couple more pictures.
One of the most unique ones is where you need to rescue someone's friend who's been forced to join up and fight with one of the factions. Make sure you don't kill that guy accidentally while you subdue his captors. It's just a much more varied bunch of missions, and while you are going to see a bit of repetition, that's to be expected given the size of the city, it's far less than it could have been.
No one gets away from me.
It's just one of the few open world games where I've actively gone out there and spent all that extra time completing all of the side stuff, and along with Infamous 2, it's one of the few games I took the time to platinum.
Man, you are one pathetic loser.
Going back and replaying through this now in 2022, which I did over the span of about 3 or 4 days, on and off, it really felt like I was replaying a new game. And it's kind of sad that the most excited I get when playing a game these days is replaying something from 13 odd years ago. But hey, that's the Infamous effect for you. Thanks for watching. Yeah, now we can't stop there. I should at least mention the sequels.
What just happened?
Now, Infamous would eventually get 2 sequels. You had Infamous 2 in 2011, and then Infamous Second Son for the PlayStation 4 later on in 2014. And I think they're a perfect example of 2 games chasing their tails, trying to recapture what made that first one so good. If nothing else, Infamous 2 is a good story sequel though to the first one. Starts off almost where the first game finished, with Cole having to defend Empire City after this prophesized beast attacks, destroying the entire place like it's a kid knocking over a sandcastle. The prologue begins with the Beast and Cole having this epic one-on-one to the point that he totally burns himself out trying to destroy it, which from the gameplay point of view explains why he loses most of his powers. He then flees to the very New Orleans-inspired town of New Marais to regain his abilities, along with some new ones, with the ever-looming threat of the Beast now approaching. In fact, every time you pause the game, you can see on a map screen how close it is to New Marais. It's a pretty cool idea, and it makes the impending presence of this super powerful creature always hang in the back of your mind. The thing is though, New Marais is pretty similar to Empire City in terms of the layout. It's really just another series of random buildings and electrical lines for you to grind across. The only difference now is that instead of train lines, they're tram lines. Oh, come on. There is a definite visual improvement almost across the board, but still got a very janky feeling to it, especially the platforming, and the animations are mostly unchanged. Getting to the top of buildings is somewhat less painful this time, as you can shoot upwards off electrical poles and also later on vault yourself into the air with a pillar of ice, but it's still the same loop of just jumping up the side of walls until you reach the top. It's also a really good example of the turning point where Sony games started to focus much more on cinematics.
I guess it's time I go introduce myself.
And you can see that firsthand with all of these new motion captured cutscenes, some of which just seem to drag on forever and are unskippable on the first playthrough. A lot of the characters also seem over-designed now, and by over-designed I mean look at how much needless detail they have on their outfits. I mean, there's a difference between a character's outfit being detailed but then being needlessly cluttered.
You want to tell me what this is all about?
The biggest fuck up here though is that they've replaced Cole's voice actor with someone entirely new, and combined with his new appearance, it at times doesn't even look or sound like the same character.
I guess it's time I go introduce myself.
It's like playing Duke Nukem and hearing someone other than John St. John doing Duke, someone other than David Hayter voicing Solid Snake, or someone other than Michael Ironside voicing Sam Fisher. Oh wait, they did that, didn't they?
Karma's a bitch. I get it.
I don't think the new voice actor does a bad job, but it's definitely jarring hearing this guy, especially back to back if you're going into this game after playing the first one. Then you've got these 2 new side characters, Quo and Nix, who basically symbolize the good and the bad moral choices. I mean, it's literally like having an angel or a devil on your shoulder when you're forced to make all these judgment calls. And again, you can keep raising or lowering your alignment, which comes with this animation where it kind of looks like the quickening from Highlander or something. Still though, randomly moving around the city and stopping random bystanders from being mugged, abducted, along with defusing shard bombs is still a pretty fun aspect of the free roaming, so they definitely nailed that aspect. I kinda like to how the decisions you make not only change the powers you get, but then also the story missions you play through, you know, just adding another layer to the whole replayability factor. If you side with Quo, you get all these ice abilities. If you side with Nyx, something which again I've never done because I'm too much of a pussy, well, you get a completely different power set instead. But the thing is though, unlike the first game, with Infamous 2, I just never felt like I was getting stronger. I mean, it's not like in the first game how you'd get upgrades to how much damage your abilities do. Here though, instead of that, you're really just getting different versions of each ability. Even unlocking the new powers now is kinda lame. I mean, in Infamous 1, you jacked into these power outlets and literally overcharged your body with energy to learn a new ability. Here though, Cole overloads these blast cores, which then causes him to black out, and then when he wakes up like a few hours later, he's got a new ability.
3 weeks later.
I mean, that's not badass though, man. It's like watching someone pass out from doing a shot of whiskey or something. Just kinda makes him look like a little bitch.
What happened?
The best ones are again gate kept until late into the campaign, very late. Like the Rocket Bolt, for instance, you don't get about until 30 missions in. Whereas in the first game, I think it was about 17 missions. And the other basic bolts aren't really upgrades anymore. Like I said, they're more like alternate versions of the same attack. So you've still got the basic bolt, but now you can get the pincer bolt, which fires out 3 at once. There's the magnum bolt, which is like a slower, more powerful bolt in theory. And then later on, you can also get rapid fire bolts too. Then if you've sided with Quo, you get an ice blast, which fires out shards of ice along with an ice grenade. But to me, they just kind of feel like different means to achieve the same goal, and I just never felt that escalation in power that I got from the first game. Not to mention, swapping through them in combat just fucks up the whole flow of everything. This Ionic Vortex thing I think is the perfect example because it really is just a watered down version of the Lightning Storm from the first game. I mean, it can't even destroy vehicles. Look, it just goes right through them. It's also a bit of a get out of jail free card, you know, to get the heat off you when the abundance of enemies during combat encounters just gets out of control.
Fuck you!
Even the old precision bolt doesn't zoom in as much anymore, you know, kind of defeating the purpose of it being called a precision bolt. Melee combat has the illusion of being improved when really all they've done is give you a melee weapon and then added in these cinematic angles when you hit someone. You're really just kind of mashing the square button until the meter fills up, then you can press triangle to do a finishing move. I mean, that's literally it. There's no block move, there's no parry move, there's not even any kind of counterattack. The main enemy force in the game is a militia group. Gone are the Reapers, the Dustmen, and the First Sons. Now it's just this one faction. They also seem to be really spongy, often surviving multiple headshots, and they've really doubled down on the whole explosive enemy types too. Not only including guys with rocket launchers, but then also guys who can throw grenades. Yeah, yippee. Once you make it to the second area, aptly named Flood Town, you come up against the Icemen, and these guys are just a complete chore to fight. I mean, they're not really outright hard to fight, but it's just kind of annoying and tedious to beat them with all the tricks they have. It's also kind of annoying too how you're still putting up with the same old shit when it comes to the missions. Like standing on the back of a slow moving vehicle and having to fight off dozens of enemies, you know, that's still about as fun as a colonoscopy. The worst ones where you've got to defend a bunch of generators is you're charging up all the different sections of the city, and during these they quite literally throw like 20 or 30 enemies at you at the one time and, you know, just expect you to hold them all off. But where they shit the bed harder than Amber Heard is with this new enemy group called the Corrupted, weird looking mutant creatures that feel like something out of an entirely different game. Now look, I get they felt the needed to escalate things from the first game, I get it. But if this was the best choice, well, look, there had to be a plan B.
Fuck this shit!
The most common ones just run around and try to attack you at close range, which really again shows how lacking the melee combat is. Then you've got these kamikaze exploding variants because, yeah, that's always fun to fight. And they're just so unremarkable and uncreative to look at. You know, they just look like any kind of monster or mutant creature you'd see in, I don't know, any other game. You got these larger, tougher mini-boss type enemies too that always have a very specific weakness you've got to batter down over time. You know, slowly, methodically wearing them down, like trying to piss away the skid mark stains on a public toilet bowl.
Yes. Yeah.
But again, it just feels like something out of an entirely different game. It's like I've crossed over into Starship Troopers or something, and I'm half expecting Michael Ironside to pop out at this point and start reaming me out. I mean, what the hell is this thing? It's like a giant armored dung beetle or something. Yeah, it kinda looks familiar. Well, how about this thing that burrows into the ground, popping out for literal seconds before hiding again? Yeah, that's fun. I don't know, man, I can see how some people might like this stuff, but to me, they're just very repetitive and tedious encounters, and they're just more time-consuming than skill-based. The fact, too, that most of the side missions involve having to kill these things ain't helping either. Even something as simple as shooting down a chopper, which you're going to have to do many times here, is drawn out way more than it needs to be.
Eventually.
It actually kind of makes me miss how easy it was destroying military vehicles in Prototype, and I mean at this point I'm using that game as a positive comparison. Yikes. Now, when Infamous 2 first came out all those years ago, I do remember liking it quite a bit, but I think going back and playing it now, especially right after the first game, I can start to see now why some people didn't like it as much. Overall, it's not a bad sequel, and it does have a suitable ending, which wraps things up into a neat little package, finishing the story off in a poignant and effective way. Plus, it also had one of the best DLC expansion packs of all time, with Festival of Blood, where you could pretty much play as a vampire. And I could probably spend an entire video sucking that DLC's dick, which, you know, maybe I'll do in the future.
Let's get the hell out of here. Figure something else out.
But really, after Infamous 2, it's like Cole's story is done and dusted, and it seemed like the Infamous universe is all wrapped up, which kind of makes you wonder why they'd ever attempt to make another one. But that's sure as hell what they did, Sonny Jim, when they made Infamous Second Son.
Hey, are you okay? Okay. I'm better than okay, man. I think I picked up a new trick.
Playing through Infamous Second Son for the first time was when I really started to realise that not everything Sony touches turns to gold automatically, and the mediocrity of this game is what really hammered that home for me. It's a game that story-wise never really needed to be made, and much like Killzone Shadowfall, it just kind of feels like Sony trying to use brand recognition more as a marketing tool to influence people to buy a game and a console they might otherwise not have touched.
Whoa! No!
It even kind of rehashes the same origin story and dynamic, it's just that this time instead of Cole and Zeke, it's Delson Rowe and his brother Reggie.
Come on, man, I know you took a bump to the head, but you two didn't exactly hit it off last time you were together.
Still the same setup though, with Delson getting these powers unintentionally, then coming to grasp with how that's going to affect the lives of the people around him. The thing is though, Delson isn't anywhere near as likable as Cole is, and the whole punk vibe thing he's got going on here is completely hit and miss.
What?
You've got to remember too that this game came out at the arse end of the scene era.
Oh yeah?
Scene culture, for people who don't know or don't remember, was this period through the early 2000s and then on into the early 2010s, which honestly might be one of the worst fashion trends of all time. And you can see the remnants of that, I think, in these character designs in Second Son. And you know, it's a culture that I never really got into. So as a result, Delson walking around with his hoodie, his denim vest, his perfectly angled beanie with the straightened hair peeking out of the top just doesn't gel with me. Not to mention, it's also the era of video game protagonists having to make constant quips and remarks during gameplay.
Not bad, huh? Hey, you want to see it again?
Which means Delson never really does shut up. He's kind of like a more annoying, unfunny version of Peter Parker.
Relax.
I think too that's also a byproduct of motion captured actors because, you know, you've got all these guys riffing on a soundstage, so a lot of that improv stuff's going to come across as seeming more natural and less scripted, which ends up in the game. Despite this heightened level of storytelling though, the moral choices in the game are still entirely black and white, to the point that you're often just choosing to outright help someone or completely fuck their life up entirely. Delson's trying to track down 3 escaped conduits and absorb their powers so he can add it to his own roster to defeat a woman named Augustine, who kinda looks like a substitute maths teacher.
Very funny.
And when you come into contact with these guys, you then have to choose whether or not to help them or exploit them for your own ends. I do kinda like the way this game handles the premise of people being conduits though. It approaches it in the sense that society misunderstands them and calls them conduits as a bit of a condescending term. Although most of these guys are innocent people just trying to get by, the way the public treats them, being scared and angry, more due to a lack of understanding or awareness, is ironically what makes these people go bad. And Delson plays a big part in that when he interacts with some of these key characters.
Should be my responsibility.
I do think visually these new powers are kind of cool. You've got smoke, neon, video, and eventually concrete, and they all play out pretty differently too. Smoke is kind of like a brawler power. You can dash around, you can send out explosive blasts, and use air vents to quickly circumvent platforming and to get to the rooftops faster, which I have to say is a god tier quality of life inclusion.
Oh, yeah!
Neon, on the other hand, is more precision based. You can slow down time and fire off beams at specific body parts to subdue enemies in a single hit, and you can also dash around as a literal being of light, which looks awesome. Definitely feels more like an ability used to show off the console, evident by how creative it looks when you drain these neon power sources. Because I think otherwise these are kind of ghetto powers, man. I mean, smoke and video, kind of lame, right? It reminds me of these old episodes of Captain Planet when they had Captain Pollution showing up. Captain Planet had all these cool rings like fire, wind, and water, whereas Captain Pollution had stuff like radiation, deforestation, and smog.
Smog! I am Captain Pollution!
I mean, look, smoke ain't that far removed from smog.
Smog!
I mean, look, again, if nothing else, these effects do look cool though. It's actually kind of crazy how well this game holds up visually almost a decade later. Apart from the nighttime though, where it becomes so dark, it's like you're looking into the asshole of a coal miner. Otherwise though, it's still an amazing looking game. But that's kind of the problem here with Second Son, and the issue I have with a lot of PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 5 titles is that despite having these incredible production values, when you get down to the nitty gritty, they still play like older games, like there's something from a previous generation. Like the melee combat is the same old button mashing repetition of pressing square to hit someone and then occasionally the circle button to evade if you need to get away. They've even removed the finishes from Infamous 2, so if anything it's a downgrade. When you start getting into combat, you realise yet again you're still getting shot at by people with rifles who are often camping on the top of nearby rooftops and can shoot you with pinpoint accuracy. Combat in Second Son though is more about subduing enemies now than it is outright defeating them, because each power has like an ultimate move which can wipe out a small area, but to charge this up, you need to subdue multiple enemies.
Gotcha, bitch!
And this is done by pressing triangle on someone when a giant button prompt appears above their head. Gotta say though, I do think it's a neat touch how enemies are often gonna surrender if they're the last one left, which is always pretty funny to watch.
Say goodnight.
One of the earliest powers is called Sulfur Bomb, which releases a fart cloud that instantly stuns enemies, leaving them wide open to be subdued non-lethally. And it's kind of like, why would you bother trying to whittle all these guys' health down with the other attacks, when you could just incapacitate an entire group at once with a single ability? It's kind of like the same thing later on when you get the neon powers. One of the first ones you get is being able to slow down time, zoom in, and then hit an enemy's weak spot to instantly subdue them. You don't even need to be at melee range for this, you can just do it entirely out of their reach. Then even better than that, throw out a stasis bomb which holds enemies in the air for a few seconds, making them even easier targets. When this thing's upgraded, you don't even need to hit their weak spot. You can just shoot them anywhere for it to be an instant subduction. Subduction? Is that a word? Much like Infamous 2, you often have to take on these incredibly annoying conduit enemies, but again, they're really just these annoying and time-consuming encounters, which just feel like a chore to get through. And don't even get me started on the boss fights. I mean, holy shit.
Don't hurt me, Nelson!
The biggest stuff up though is that you don't get XP points for fighting enemies anymore, which kind of begs the question as to why I'd even bother. Outside of just clearing out enemies during missions because I had to, or to unlock a fast travel spot on the map, I've just kind of wondered why I'd be wasting my time. Upgrades are tied again to finding blast shards, and that's that whole rigmarole of running around the map to find them, which is again another example of this thing just recycling old mechanics without really adding anything new to them. The thing that annoys me the most though is how you don't get a visual notification when you've knocked someone out anymore. I mean, if you look back to the other games, when someone was knocked out, you'd get this takedown notification on the screen to let you know that was done. Though in Second Son you don't get that prompt anymore, and it can be kind of confusing to tell when someone's been knocked out, because the hit feedback isn't all that helpful. When I first played through Second Son all those years ago, I binged through the whole thing in a matter of days. I think though only because there was nothing else on the PlayStation 4 to play at the time. But after that, the only time I've ever come back to it was when I was capturing footage for this video.
Very funny.
Playing through Infamous 1 again though, I could barely put that thing down, and the same thing to a lesser extent with the sequel. The best way I'd describe Second Son though is that it's a game. I can confirm that it is most definitely a game. You press buttons and it correlates to something happening on the screen. Are people going to be talking about this thing in the years to come? Well, yeah, probably, but definitely not in the same way they're going to be talking about that first game. I was kind of surprised at the reception it got too when I brought up Infamous on Twitter recently. And I think really that's the ultimate compliment a game can have, right? If you bring up an almost 15-year-old game and it instantly takes people back to how they felt playing it for the first time, well, then that's the real testament to the impact that it has.
I'm on it, brother.
Either way though, this is still the most fun you're ever gonna have, slamming into the ground off a high building and beating up a bunch of hobos dressed up in trash bags.